Hello, BBC. This is Chester Wilmot, speaking from a hill looking down into Germany. Everything's firing today, as perhaps you'll have gathered. Not only the regular guns, but what the gunners call the pepper pot, made up of ack-ack guns, tank guns, anti-tank guns, heavy machine guns, that just spray the German defences and add to the discomfort. And those shells have been crashing down on German pillboxes and gun positions, mortar positions, headquarters, roads, concentration areas, and so on. These have been pounded by well over 1,000 guns.
It was the biggest artillery bombardment yet of the Northwest European campaign. It lasted 5.5 hours. Then, at 10:30 hours, infantry and armour crossed the start lines. It had started to rain.
They moved slowly through the mud that was over their boot tops. Mud that sucked their feet back, lead and clinging mud that wrapped itself round their boots and made every step slow and heavy. But even so, there was purpose in their step. The Canadian Army was really attacking into Germany for the first time.
Come on, Oxfords, up front!
In spite of these conditions, the infantry, by and large, made good progress and kept pace with their barrages. Devastating artillery fire had cut all enemy line communications and prevented the use of runners. German troops were found overwhelmed and demoralized. The majority only too happy to surrender. For the armor, it was a very different story, for the waterlogged ground soon gave way, and the majority bogged and blocked the routes. But a few tanks, and the all-important funnies, the special armor, did manage to struggle forward to make crossings over anti-tank ditches and trenches, and to flame out the few pockets of enemy resistance.
The company commander heard some noise coming from a house standing in open country. He ordered this sergeant to take a patrol to investigate. And when they were within 30 or 40 yards of the house, German sentry appeared to be rudely and quietly dealt with by the patrol. The sergeant then decided to attack the farmhouse. Threw grenades through the windows and, entering the house, fired repeatedly down the staircase into the cellar. After a certain amount of shouting and obvious panic below, 30 fully armed German parachutists emerged with their hands up. When it was explained to them that they had been dealt with by a total of 3 men, they thought that the sergeant and the others had been very unfair indeed.
They've hung out the washing on the Siegfried Line. Now in the massive new offensive, Operation Veritable, troops of the 1st Canadian Army are ruthlessly winkling out the enemy from the ruins of the old medieval town of Cleve. It's all part of the plan to destroy Hitler's armies west of the Rhine and send Allied columns streaking into the heart of the Reich. The men who direct this operation, Field Marshal Montgomery and General Crerar of the 1st Canadian Army, are making a valiant bid to force that western door to Berlin.
But the battle was not going according to plan. It had been intended that Operation Veritable, with General Horrocks' British 30 Corps temporarily under Canadian command, would break through the so-called Siegfried Line, then make a spirited 40-kilometer dash to the Rhine opposite Wesel. The operation was to have been part of a pincer move, but the start of the US 9th Army's Operation Grenade had been delayed by denial operations, which flooded the Ruhr Valley and allowed the Germans to concentrate the bulk of their best units against Operation Veritable. Allied troops were particularly wary of the enemy fighting from cellars, a traditional feature of German architecture, but of such solid construction, with their street-level windows giving good, mutually supporting fields of fire, that the Allies believed they had been specially designed for war. In fact, they were vulnerable to grenade and flame attack, and there was usually only one way out. So that after offering initial resistance, the defenders seldom remained to oppose the assaults mounted to overcome them. But for both sides, cellars made useful headquarters and proved welcome protection from artillery and aerial bombardments. But what had been happening elsewhere on the front? In the 4 relatively quiet months preceding Operation Veritable, the Reichswald had been the one prominent, forbidding, almost sinister feature dominating the landscape, and clearly a formidable obstacle if defended resolutely. Very little could be learned of the Siegfried Line defenses in the forest, and fueled by German propaganda, they were greatly overrated. For in the event, they turned out to be a double line of trenches, a series of bunkers, and virtually unmanned. The Allies' opening artillery bombardment so overwhelmed the Germans in their forward defenses that few remained with either the will or the organization to fall back to defend the Siegfried position. The advance was slowed far more by the bad weather and ground conditions, which necessitated a 48-hour pause, while engineers, pioneers, and anyone else who could be spared, including fighting troops of reserve brigades, struggled to improve the routes so that essential supplies could be moved forward and casualties evacuated. In such conditions, there were few vehicles capable of moving at all. As night fell, the 3rd Canadian Division advanced towards the villages isolated in the floods. Nicknamed the Water Rats, their operations were made possible by these amphibious tracked vehicles, yet another invaluable Allied funny, the Buffalo, capable of carrying personnel or light vehicles and armed with machine guns and any other weapons their commanders could lay their hands on. Maintaining direction in the dark wasn't easy, but one commander solved the problem by calling for a stonk on the objective and following the resulting fires. In the shallow water, anti-personnel mines and wire played havoc with the tracks. Currents quickened as the floods rose, but targets were strafed, infantry was landed, and the villages cleared one by one.
General Simpson's 9th Army GIs buckle on lifebelts as they get ready for the hazardous job of bridging the fast-flowing River Ruhr, the biggest natural obstacle barring the way to the Rhine. An unusually short and intense barrage, it lasted only 3/4 of an hour, swept the assault area with unprecedented thoroughness. The use of smoke is a feature of General Simpson's tactics in this operation. Artificial fog screens engineer squads and assault troops as effectively as the news blackout which descended over the first days of the offensive. Lorry-borne pontoons lumber like grounded barrage balloons to the water's edge. Bridging a river of this width, running a 4-knot current and within range of enemy guns is a tough assignment. Beneath the water, the enemy puts stakes, wire, and floating mines.
Once across, the Americans, unlike the British and Canadians, pushed their armor forward with scant regard to its flanks. In 3 days, their bridgehead was already 32 kilometers wide by 16 deep and expanding rapidly. The 4 divisions of the German 15th Army, with no reserves remaining to reinforce them, faced imminent collapse. In the forests flanking the gap, small groups of paratroopers, sometimes only a couple of men and a machine gun, all too often halted the troops of the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions. Others mounted violent counterattacks or infiltrated the Canadian positions. Underfoot, the forest floor had been thickly sown with anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. There was no panic about the German withdrawal, which was carried out silently at night and was undetected by the Allies. Huge craters, anything up to 35 meters across, were blasted in roads. Trees and telegraph poles were felled. Mines were laid and bridges blown, all to create obstacles which, when covered by a couple of well-placed guns, slowed the Allied advance and created valuable time for the defenders. German troops were exhausted after nearly 3 weeks of continuous hard fighting. Any replacements were either elderly or youths in their teens. Yet, for all their superior resources, it was to take the Allies a further week's bitter fighting to eliminate a bridgehead that was now no deeper than 15 kilometers. The final battles began at Ossenberg, Alpen, Veen, and Xanten. An attack on Xanten 2 days earlier had been thrown back. Now, at 0500 hours, in darkness and driving rain, 3 battalions, supported by crocodile flamethrowers, advanced behind an intense artillery barrage to try again. Hitler had ordered troops of the 6th Parachute Division to fight to the last, and it took 4.5 hours of costly and gallant fighting to overcome resistance, then cross the anti-tank ditch, and a further 8 hours, the commitment of a 4th Battalion and more heavy casualties to flush the defenders from the ruins of the badly bombed town. For platoon commanders, some without radios, the problem was one of communications. In the noise and smoke, it was far from easy to maintain control of sections and to direct the fire of supporting armor to dislodge the well-concealed defenders from the mass of rubble and craters. For the 21st Army Group, the fight for the west bank of the Rhine was over. But instead of the 3 or 4 days originally planned, it had taken 31, and the cost in dead and wounded was high. So what went wrong, and what is there to learn? In 1982, a group of officers at the headquarters of the Northern Army Group made a detailed study of Operations Veritable and Blockbuster in the course of preparing a battlefield tour. Oberstleutnant Burkhard Frank of the 11th Panzer Grenadier Division and Major Peter Knox of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers were members of that group. Going back to the beginning of the battle, were they able to come to any conclusions concerning the soundness of the planning for Operation Veritable?
We did come to a number of conclusions, and one of them was perhaps the lack of manoeuvre that Horrocks gave himself. Now, he said after the battle, "My attack was to take place between the Maas and the Rhine. There was, therefore, no room for manoeuvre and no scope for cleverness." Now, I think that by choosing to attack with 5 divisions up, which in effect meant that at best only 1 brigade was leading, with perhaps 2 assaulting battalions, it meant when opposition or obstacles were encountered, they had to be overcome not by a flanking manoeuvre, but by frontal assault. Perhaps I would also criticise his choice of his reserve divisions. His leading reserve division was 43 Wessex Division, an infantry division, and his follow-up reserve division was the Guards Armoured, which was a heavy armoured division, trained and practiced primarily in breaching operations such as this, and not trained for rapid exploitation, as was the 7th Armoured Division, which at that time was still under command of 2nd British Army.
Well, that is true, but from a German point of view, this plan had every chance for a quick success, because first, it could and did achieve surprise. Second, it succeeded in gathering a very favorable force ratio for the British. And third, it hit the German front at its weakest point. The only criticism I have, according to the plan, is that it depended very much on hard frozen ground, whereas in this part of Germany and in this part of the year, frozen ground is rather the exception than the rule.
So, the Germans were surprised by an overwhelmingly superior force striking at their weakest sector. But the assessment of the likely weather and ground conditions was unrealistic. divisions were allowed virtually no room for tactical maneuver, and the choice and commitment of 30 Corps reserve formations was questionable. When Operation Veritable failed to achieve its objectives, did the planning for Operation Blockbuster show any improvement?
We felt that 2nd Canadian Corps' attack against the Hochwald was very much a repetition of 30th Corps' attack against the Reichswald, with the main effort against a very narrow strip of tank-going terrain and otherwise attack into the woods. The major difference possibly that this time the attack was conducted against the point of main German strength and not against the German weakest point. I think that the Canadians did also the mistake that they repeated their attacks on the narrow Hochwald gap several times after it had been beaten off by the Germans, instead of moving the point of main effort or of reassuming the attack on a broader front.
But I think we agreed that the General Crerar, the Canadian Army commander, was under great pressure from his Canadian subordinates to allow them a greater share of the battle honours. I think this was an instance when he should have resisted that national pressure. He must have known the good progress being made by the Americans in the South, and also the progress being made by his own 30 British Corps as they pushed south to effect the link-up with the US 9th Army.
Exactly. This was, I think, the right point for 1st Canadian Army to shift the effort back to 30th British Corps, to launch an attack into the rear of the German divisions still defending at the Mars line, to cut them off, to disrupt the German defense, and then to thrust towards Wesel Bridge, thus ending the whole campaign.
The use of airborne or special services units behind the enemy front was not included in either of the plans. Turning to the implementation of the plans, what were the study group's main conclusions about the conduct of the operations?
Well, it is easy to criticise with hindsight, but there certainly were a number of missed opportunities. The first, I think, was to delay by the 15th Scottish Division whilst they waited for the set-piece breaching brigade to come up and breach the Siegfried Line, where the previous evening a patrol had crossed the line and found a village deserted of enemy, and a battalion had crossed the road bridge and made some considerable progress. Instead of acting on this information, the division seemed quite content to wait for the planned set-piece operation to cross the line as planned.
Similarly, you could say that 53rd Division missed their opportunity when they had seized their objectives at the eastern part of the Reichswald and were waiting. I think it's the duty of any commander, once he has reached his intermediate objective, to continue the attack even if he has no orders of his superior, and to keep in contact with the enemy or to assist his flank formations. The same was true for 15th Division, which had similar problems on the Materborn feature. I think they also choose the wrong area for vital ground because in this case, the exits from the Materborn should have been their vital ground, whereas the access to the Materborn would have been the vital ground for the Germans.
After the war, Horrocks did admit that the timing of the injection of 43 Wessex was his greatest mistake of the war, and I think we can't disagree with that. At the time he committed them, 15th Scottish Division had, although they had been in action for 2 days, were not exhausted and had not received the number of casualties that they expected, and they could probably have used their own reserve to continue the advance, where instead Horrocks committed his reserve, his core reserve, on a already congested axis. This only served to provide more delay and gave the Germans yet more time to bring up their reserves.
Speed was essential for Operation Veritable's success, so perhaps 30 Corps ought to have set more ambitious objectives. When events overtook the original plan, a more flexible and opportunist approach by formation commanders might have produced better results. And although General Horrocks' premature commitment of his Corps reserve caused a virtual 48-hour standstill, it was only one of many factors influencing the slowness of Operation Veritable's advance. Intense artillery and aerial bombardments created obstacles that hampered movement and aided the defenders.
This campaign was one of the rare occasions in war history that an army suffered from too much equipment, I think. These large British tank columns inevitably churned up the soft clay ground and got stuck, causing the infantry to wait, and thus it occurred that infantry was delayed by armor, which is especially a sad thing to tell for an armor officer like me. In addition, there was virtually no chance for a rapid exploitation by armored units, even if British units could have done that.
An example of that must be the failure of the 43rd Wessex Division to continue the exploitation when they had broken through 15 Panzer Grenadier to a depth of 4.5 kilometres and actually got across the Goch-Kaukau road. They made no attempt to continue the exploitation further south. But I think if you criticise the British use of armour, I think you must agree that the special to task armour of 79th Armoured Division was used very well, and without that armour, such operations as the Canadian amphibious operations in the north would not have been possible without the use of the Buffaloes. And although the other armour, the flails and flamethrowers, had the same movement problems, there's no doubt that when they were used to good effect. And certainly we in NATO today would welcome the reintroduction of some of those equipments, and in particular a mechanical means of breaching minefields.
Yes, this is certainly one of the lessons of this battle, that infantry with the support of armor is stronger than infantry without, even in heavily wooded terrain or built-up areas. And I must add that the Germans especially feared the crocodile. This was the one British weapon which always succeeded. However, I must really state that the British use of armor lacked a bit the element of surprise. These attacks were a bit stereotyped, though normally successful, and hence they were predictable, allowing the defender always to bring up fresh reserves and to prevent a British breakthrough.
The fact that the Germans managed to maintain a cohesive front was a considerable achievement, especially in light of the condition of their army at that time.
Most German divisions had been destroyed once or even twice during the retreat in France or during the subsequent German counterattack in the Ardennes, and they had to be reformed in the subsequent months. On the other hand, the situation in Germany was such that Germany had lost already 7.5 million soldiers in the army alone up to then, and was losing another 500,000 per month. The consequence of this was that the newly formed infantry divisions were poorly equipped and were poorly trained. And these infantry soldiers really just did what they were told to do, but not much more. This was different with the para divisions, which consisted of volunteers from Air Force units, with little experience as infantry as well, but with a good fighting spirit. A precondition for their commitment in this area was, however, the evacuation of the civilians from that area. And this evacuation had started 3 months earlier already. This allowed the German side, for instance, to prepare these widespread denial operations, among which the flooding of the Rhine Valley and of the Ruhr Valley were the most prominent, which may have been worth an additional 2 or even 3 divisions for the German side. It also allowed the Germans to make full use of the houses and villages and towns, which is necessary for any defender, I think. Let me add another point which came out and turned out of value for the German side in this stage of the battle. This was that you had to rely on a reserve for quick counterattacks or for blocking operations, and that the minimum strength of this reserve would be about 1 battalion per division.
Certainly the whole team were most impressed by the skillful use made by the Germans of their limited reserves, but I don't think they can escape criticism, because at times they tended to counterattack before they had been able to formulate good plans. For instance, the attack by 47 Panzer Corps south of Cleve was carried out before most of their armour and artillery had arrived, and consequently it was ill-prepared and failed when it came up against much stronger British opposition.
Yes, this is certainly true. All these large-scale counterattacks, either by 47 Panzer Corps or by Panzerlehr, were hastily planned and were executed with too little and too late.
If German counterattack philosophy was wasteful, and the easily detected defences of the Siegfried Line type proved unsatisfactory, skillful use of the terrain for the sighting of well-concealed, mutually supporting defensive positions was not. The German command system speeded reaction time, for divisional chiefs of staff were decision-makers in their own right, which was invaluable when generals were out of touch with their headquarters. most remarkable of all, perhaps, was the way German morale remained unbroken, particularly in the parachute divisions, at a time when all might have seemed lost. The 21st Army Group and the 1st Canadian Army's senior commanders saw the battle for the Rhineland as a success, claiming that since the 1st Parachute Army had been defeated west of the Rhine, opposition would be negligible when they eventually crossed the river. Operations Veritable and Blockbuster cost 15,600 British and Canadian lives. The Germans lost some 22,000 killed or seriously wounded and a similar number of prisoners. They lost a further 16,000 casualties and 30,000 captured in Operation Grenade, which cost the Americans about 7,300 casualties. But Schlem's 1st Parachute Army, against overwhelming odds, had slowed the 1st Canadian Army's advance to an average of 2 kilometers a day for 31 days and made an orderly withdrawal across the Rhine. It was far from being a minor achievement.